So I want to briefly touch back on Operation Popeye, which flooded out the Ho Chi Minh Trail, was used in the Vietnam War. 6 planes.
Yeah, the entire fleet that was used, I've read, was only 6 planes. They were able to extend the monsoon season by 60 days.
Yeah.
There's a pilot called Ben Livingstone, and he's talked about how successful it was.
Yeah.
Although it's obviously played down because they don't want anyone to realise how effective weather modification can be. Weather modification is basically poo-pooed. Everyone says no, it doesn't work.
It's a conspiracy theory. We've never done it. It doesn't work.
It's crazy. But they were experimenting by deploying CO2 in the 1930s in Holland. Before the war, and I would imagine they were using it in the Second World War. I haven't come across any recorded evidence to suggest that, but there have been certainly unusual situations. You could say the Blitzfreeze in Russia. There was heavier than normal snowfall. It's quite possible they could have been nucleating that to enhance that. And during the firestorms of Hamburg, there were very unusual high temperatures and a period of drought that led to the perfect conditions for an horrific firestorm, where a very high civilian casualty rate followed. And there is suggestion that maybe weather modification techniques could have played a part. And I don't know if that's the case, but there's no doubt about it. It was used in the 50s in Indochina by the French.
By the Americans. I mean, Britain was using weather modification techniques, not just in Britain. They were spraying defoliant, like a precursor to the Agent Orange. Yeah. They were spraying that in Malaya during the Malayan uprisings in the 1950s. Britain was spraying poisons to destroy the food supplies with the Malayan uprisings in the 50s. So you could, although the British government seemed to be a bit more effective at keeping their operations secret. But they do, they have this thing where they've got to release stuff after 50 years. So we find out things 50 years later. Maybe.
It would be interesting to do some Freedom of Information Acts. I have talked with people from Ethiopia, from Tanzania, from South Africa, that talk about abrupt weather changes from the 50s onwards, affecting crop production, water supply through hydrological cycles. Yeah. And you have to wonder, you could speculate that did they start using weather modification?
Because the technology was there, they had the ability.
They certainly had the ability, and they also had the motivation from the point of view. King George VI commissioned a report in 1944.
Yeah.
And this was an investigation about the state of the Commonwealth, which at that time you could also call it the British Empire. As they knew they were likely to win the Second World War, they were interested to know how the geopolitical landscape would be following the Second World War, because they knew that there would be a new geopolitical landscape, because many of the nations which were members of the Commonwealth or they were exploited nations of the British Empire, they were making sacrifices by, like India. There was a very large population used militarily.
Bengal Lancers and all those other people.
Yes. And indeed earlier in the First World War. But basically there was a time where they realised these nations would want conditions, and independence would be one of those. So in this commissioned report, one of the conclusions was the British establishment were concerned about overpopulation of the Commonwealth, not because of the lack of resources,
but because these various nations might become too strong. With extra manpower, with the increase in populations, they would have larger militaries, they would have a larger workforce to improve their status.
Less dependent on Britain.
Less dependent on the colonial masters.
Yeah.
So their concern about overpopulation was that the nations under their control might break free of exploitation. And from that point onwards, we see the development of chemical agricultural technology, the use of weed killers, and I believe, pure speculation,
the Green Revolution.
The Green Revolution, I believe, likely, according to the weather changes that people from various African and third world nations have said to me, there were big changes in the weather patterns.
So tell me again about the report, how this tied to it.
What ties to it?
No, you said that this report that King George commissioned.
Yes.
And he was concerned about population increase in these countries.
In the developing nations.
In the developing nations.
So basically what they wanted to do was find ways to keep the populations down.
Yeah, okay.
And you had a series of droughts, mass starvation, famine, and there was a definite clear departure from the norm.
Well, and this is remarkably similar to Henry Kissinger's Memorandum 200 from 1970 something.
1974,
which was concerned about the development of the third world, and you needed to suppress industrialization and keep the population down.
Yeah, it's arrested development.
Yeah,
basically, he coined the phrase "food as a weapon."
Yeah,
it's which I think that some of his conclusions in 1974 will have had references from that earlier 1944 Commission report about state of the Commonwealth. Where basically it seems like the Anglo-American establishment work in unison, and it would seem that the imperialism is of mutual benefit, whether it's the US or whether it's the former colonies. It seems to be that at the higher levels in all of these governments, they are working together for a common agenda. And it would there's strong indications that that common agenda is world government, which would give the oligarchy the ultimate goal of one world government.
And we're talking about geoengineering, which talks about control of the weather. The substances they use are toxic, and they're deployed in the same way as these, declassified biological warfare experiments.
Yes.
Are deployed, and it seems. It seems that humanity is the enemy, as mentioned in the Club of Rome. And tell us about the Club of Rome.
The Club of Rome is an organisation, a non-government organisation,
a roundtable group.
Yes, that was set up in the late 60s. I think it was 67, but I'm not certain. One of the founder members was David Rockefeller, and there are other founder members.
And there's this publication, The Limits of Growth.
Yes. Well, I can't think of the name of the other co-founder, or another one of the co-founders. He made a statement that the enemy of humanity is itself.
There was a publication which was a statement of the Council of the Club of Rome, which said that we need a common enemy to unite against. And
in searching,
and when we were looking for a common enemy, droughts, famines, global warming,
the threat
of global warming would fit the bill. It concludes by saying, so the enemy is humanity itself. And when you look at the deployment of all these techniques, which are there's plenty of it declassified, and we see lots of it going on today. It seems the enemy is us, and the
and it's being deployed by this very small group that can control them.
I think essentially, if anyone cares to start researching the history of weather modification and the use of it and the confirmation that it works, you will understand that they can do precipitation enhancement. They can make it rain. They can create storms. You know, you had Project Storm Fury, that was a 20-year long running program learning how to control hurricanes and steer them. And they can create droughts because you can cloud seed to make it to stop it raining as well. You basically got the tools to strategically use to give the impression of their claims of anthropogenic global warming by having extremes of weather, by having droughts, by having floods.
You can trigger revolutions.
Obviously we've seen that in the past. Historically, we can see the use of these tools, this technology, for geopolitical reasons. Now, we only have to start realizing that the infrastructure necessary to implement these types of technologies is actually quite a small amount, in the sense that, like, for example, they were using 6 planes for Operation Popeye in Vietnam. That's not. There are military planes all over the world. Plus, if we look further to some of the patents, in 1951, there's a patent for injecting water vapor with ionic salts into the exhaust plume of aircraft in order to create the charged contrails for the use of weather modification. And there are many examples of different techniques, thousands, I believe, of techniques for weather modification going back to the 1800s and so on. And some of these from eminent people like Oliver Joseph Lodge, who discovered the electron. In 1905, he had a patent for directing energy into the atmosphere to make it rain. So what we're trying to confirm here is that the technology has been understood at the highest levels, at presidential levels, at the Royal Society at their highest levels. And if we look at the geopolitical use of this technology, they want to create one world government, and they need a threat that's a global threat. That's the critical thing, because they need a global response. What they want is everyone to agree to all this repeated hype. This basically, from the late 60s, they started to realise war will only be so effective to bring about their agenda of one world government. The Second World War brought about the creation of the European Union.
Well, the First World War got the League of Nations. Second World War, you got the United Nations, and then you got the European Union.
Critical,
first, it was a common market. It was just a little trading thing. But now, here in France and all over Europe, 90% of the laws come from an unelected commission.
Yeah, the EU Commission, exactly. Yeah. Which is basically, there is no more democracy. Just we always had an illusion of democracy, but it's really gone now. And they want to create the same type of political model for the Americas and for the Asian Pacific. And we have the TPP region.
And all that sort of they're homogenising.
So they're homogenising. Yeah. So the thing is, the use of these weather modification techniques can reasonably easily be employed to create the illusion that we've got a climatic catastrophe looming.
And we need their help.
And it requires global responses, which brings everyone into line. They want to bring in this carbon neutral society.
Carbon negative, they're talking about.
They're saying they actually want to create an infrastructure of technologies that will take CO2 out of the atmosphere. This life-giving gas that is essential to all plant life, which should be celebrated as one of the most important life-giving gases in the planet. There's such a small representation in our atmosphere anyway. It's 0.0375% of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide.
It's a trace gas.
It's a trace gas, and of this gas, only a small percentage of it is truly anthropogenic. It's about 5%. And there's a climate scientist called Murry Salby, and I would recommend everyone watch his presentations. He is a very learned...
Salby?
Salby is S-A-L-B-Y.
Okay.
He's an American professor who's at an Australian university, and he has been working out how much CO2 is actually anthropogenic. What people don't understand is there's a huge amount of CO2 is just developed naturally. When all plant life decomposes, it releases CO2. So you can imagine how much plant life there is in life. Plankton, whatever it's in the ocean, whether it's on the surface, whatever plant life is on the surface, it's all releasing CO2. Volcanoes release CO2.
Limestone.
There's all sorts of methods. It's a natural trace gas. It's not a pollutant. Right? That's a misnomer, and just another example of how the establishment are trying to demonise a life-giving gas. If you were to look at the way growers who use greenhouses and these tunnels to produce food, what they do is get a greenhouse generator, a CO2 generator for their greenhouses, and actually increase the level of CO2 in the atmosphere inside those greenhouses, because the plants thrive on it and grow much more effectively and much more healthy. It's really is a shocking misuse of science to demonise CO2 as a pollutant, and the warming effect on the actual planet is very minor. They can claim it warms, but it's minor.
Well,
the largest greenhouse gas is water. Water vapour. And what are we seeing because of these aerosol programs and these covert weather and climate modification techniques? A massive increase in clouds. We can see contrails.
The brightening of the sky, it's less blue now.
Absolutely, because it's filled with particles, aerosols. And what do aerosols act as? Cloud condensation nuclei, grouping all the water vapour together. So you're creating this blanket effect that traps in heat.
And blankets are insulators.
A blanket, exactly. So it's, I mean, and there is even, going back to one of the patents, the 1970, not patent, a paper by a Alaskan professor who was writing about the use of contrails for weather modification purposes. There he suggests, he makes references that contrails and the ice crystals that are formed in contrails would survive the fall once they spread out to contrail cirrus, and eventually they'll fall. They actually seed cloud decks at a lower level, so thereby increasing cloud cover and acting for weather modification processes. That's 1970. Towards the end of that paper, he refers to Fletcher's writings in 1965 about warming the polar basin by increasing cloud cover. Now, NASA have done studies that confirm there has been a 20-year linear increase in cloud cover at the polar basin, just in line with what Fletcher was talking about in the 60s. And this paper from 1970 he was concerned towards the end that they are already doing this in 1970, and he said that the use of contrails would be more effective than using dry ice.